Great. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Well, I'm going to try to introduce to some basic concepts, theoretical concepts of Jung's model of the psychic apparatus, and I might not delve too deeply into these concepts, since the final objective of this session is to present the hypothesis that analytical psychology could offer a huge therapeutic potential to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some time where we can expand the understanding of these basic concepts, and I would like you to excuse me for the accent in case for my pronunciation. So just give me a second. Okay, so generally speaking, Jung describes the psyche as the totality of all psychic processes, conscious and unconscious. The psyche is a self-regulating system like the body, and one that seeks to maintain a balance between opposing qualities while constantly striving for growth. This process, Jung called individuation, which will come later on this concept again. Jung saw the psyche as something that could be divided into component parts, with complexes and archetypal contents or processes or structures, if you want. These contents are personified and they function autonomously as secondary selves, as kind of divided self, because we're going to talk about the ego complex, which is the one that we usually relate to who we are, and not just as derived and independent processes. So Jung concepts of the psyche or model of the psyche could be broken down as follows: as complexes, archetypes, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, consciousness, the ego, the self, the persona, the shadow, anima and animus, or anima and animus, and many others. But the list might be pretty long. So this is a representation, two representations of Jung's model. I would like to go deeply into both of them, but for the sake of time, I cannot do that. So just for the sake of understanding, this horizontal line here is the one that divides, or just the waves that divides the unconscious processes or structures from the conscious processes or structures. In the unconscious, we find the collective unconscious, which we're going to talk about in a bit, and the personal unconscious. In the collective unconscious, there are the archetypes, which include the self or God image archetype, the Anima, Animus, other archetypes. And we also find the biological unconscious, which is our evolutionary heritage, the cultural unconscious, which is our cultural heritage, the shadow, and the personal unconscious, which is more related to our personal experiences and biography, actually. And on the conscious aspect of our self or psyche, we find the ego, which is related to the persona and which relates directly to the physical world, the environment, the society, like objects, people, climate, etc. So when talking about consciousness, Jung equated consciousness with awareness. They're not synonyms, but they are like intimately related. He stressed the role of reflection and discrimination in consciousness, which are executive processes. Consciousness includes ideas, emotions, perceptions, intuitions, and other psychological elements a person recognizes or is aware of. It is the psychological functions, consciousness, that maintains the relation of psychic contents to the ego, insofar as this relation is perceived as such by an ego. I'm going to talk about now about the ego complex, but before we talk about the ego complex, I would like to define what a complex is according to Jung. So a complex is an unconscious, or it is an unconscious, but although their origin is always unconscious, complexes may manifest as conscious structures, as is the case of the ego complex. And they are an organized set of memories, associations, fantasies, expectations, behavior patterns, and tendencies, among other elements. A complex is accompanied by core elements, which determines the character of the complex of strong emotions. So now talking about the ego complex, which in Jungian sense constitutes the core nucleus of one's field of consciousness or awareness. The ego complex is that complex around which the persona or identity of the subject centers. It appears to possess a high degree of continuity and coherence. And we can say that consciousness needs a center. And that center of consciousness is the ego complex. And this complex is the one which makes something feel as conscious. So we would say that the ego is the subject of consciousness. And actually, we know of no other kind of consciousness, nor we can imagine a consciousness without an ego, according to Jung. Now, Jung's emphasis on the ego's centrality and consciousness kind of obscure unconscious aspects of the ego, such as its denied or shadow qualities. We're going to talk in a bit about the shadow. Even though the ego is highly conscious, it has unconscious properties of its own. So the origin of the ego lies in the self-archetype, which we're going to talk about it later on in the presentation, and it forms over the course of early development as the brain attempts to add meaning and value to its various experiences. The ego is just one small portion of the self. I would like to emphasize that the self is kind of synonymous with the psyche of an individual. So the self includes the conscious and unconscious portions of an individual, of our psychic apparatus. Consciousness is selective, and the ego is that part of the self which selects the most relevant information from the environment. It chooses a direction to take based on this information taken from the environment, while the rest sinks onto the unconscious. It may therefore show up later in the form of dreams or visions, thus entering the conscious mind. Now, regarding the unconscious sector or region of the psyche or of the self, it consists of all the psychological contents and processes a person isn't aware of. The essential difference between the psyche, conscious and unconscious functions, is that consciousness is intensely concentrated on the person's immediate field of attention, while the unconscious is not concentrated, and while the unconscious is not concentrated and intensive, but shades off into obscurity. It is also highly expensive and can juxtapose the most heterogeneous elements in paradoxical ways. So Jung classifies the unconscious into the personal and collective unconscious. The personal unconscious contains all the acquisitions of a personal life. This is the personal conscious again. Ideas, sensations, perceptions, images, and emotions that are derived from personal experience, as conscious information is, but which one had forgotten, repressed, or didn't notice in the first place. This means that it never gained access to consciousness. Some intuitions or some perceptions that one wasn't never aware of. Now, when talking about the collective unconscious, this consists of the psychological contents and the patterns of life and behavior that each of us has inherited from our evolutionary past and therefore shares with all human beings. The collective unconscious is that region of the psyche that retains and transmits the common psychological inheritance of mankind. It entails all the possibilities of representation inherited through evolution. In this sense, archetypes are akin, though not the same, to engrams. An openness to forms of experience beyond everyday reality is historically essential to our humanness. Now, when talking about the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, we could say that they complement each other in a compensating relationship. This compensatory relationship is an inherent self-regulatory property of the psychic apparatus. While consciousness is selective, as I said before, and that this selection demands direction, which in the same manner requires the exclusion of everything considered irrelevant. This makes the conscious experience or orientation one-sided. This is important to understand the relation between consciousness and the unconscious, and our modern way of life, which is very one-sided and conscious-oriented. The contents that are excluded and inhibited by the chosen direction sink onto the unconscious, where they form a counterweight to the conscious orientation. And this is that dynamic between conscious and unconscious. So what sinks until the unconscious might come back in way of visions, dreams, hallucinations, um, depending on how intensely we repress them or how one-sided is our conscious mind. So, as I was saying, unconscious content eventually breaks through into conscious awareness in the forms of dreams, fantasies, or psychosomatic disturbances when talking about psychopathological phenomena. Every conscious processes that goes too far or becomes too extreme inevitably brings about a compensation. The more one-sided the conscious attitude, the more antagonistic are the contents arising from the unconscious, so that we may speak of an opposition between consciousness and the unconscious. But there might be a collaboration between conscious and unconscious processes. As I was saying before, the psyche is a self-regulatory system assist the body. And we could say that the collaboration of the unconscious to the conscious experience is intelligent and purposive. Even when the unconscious acts in opposition to consciousness, and not much in opposition, but as in a compensating way, its expression is still compensatory in an intelligent and purposive way, as if it were trying to restore a lost balance. In this relation, or in this reciprocity, there is a transformative potential for even the most problematic reactions to unconscious images and emotions. So I think it is important to bring here that psychological confusion and darkness often accompany the ego's confrontation with the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And this is important for the experiences under the psychedelic substances, and more importantly, even when we're talking about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. We can face the confusion and darkness triggered by a confrontation with the archetypal world. We can advance the psychological transformation or trigger the individuation process, which we're going to talk about just in a few slides. Psychological transformation cannot occur unless the ego is altered. So this one-sidedness of consciousness must be shaken to go through this transformation process. Okay, so there is this paradoxical necessity and danger of altering the ego in the service of psychological transformation is analogous to the risks and potential benefits inherent in psychedelic experience, as I was just mentioning before. So I've been mentioning the individuation process, which is a core Jungian concept. When we talk about individuation, we're talking about bringing unconscious content to consciousness. And this is a process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, which means a separate, indivisible unity, or more importantly, a whole, an integrated whole. This process is never totally achievable, but the tendency to achieve this wholeness, this holistic experience, is actually the purpose of the analytic psychotherapy. It is this process, the individuation process, entails an expansion of the sphere of consciousness. So we are never abandoning consciousness. We're trying to bring unconscious contents by the means of symbols, dream interpretation, daydreaming, or psychedelic experiences to enrich our conscious psychological life through a constructive relationship with the unconscious. So I've heard that many people talk about the dissolution of the ego or the death of the ego, but this is just a matter of space. Actually, if the ego dies, we would come into a kind of coma. And even in the meditation, when ego disappears, it is not dead. It might have dissolved transitorily, but it's not totally dead. So for us to be aware of this experience of meditation, there's gotta be some remnant of ego there. It is very important because um, when we try to, in analytical psychology, when we try to bring unconscious elements to consciousness, which is actually possible, we just access the unconscious indirectly through symbols. We're not talking about to annihilating the conscious region of the psyche. Now, so the unconscious actually is like a treasure of hidden information that might expand our consciousness. It is also an extension of the sphere of consciousness, as I was saying, which implies an enrichment of the conscious psychological life. And it also implies a movement towards wholeness, as I was saying, which is an extraordinarily important undertaking. And it's a perpetual process. You can never achieve this wholeness. It's just a process that goes on and on and on until the last day of your life if you are taking this trail. And it seeks a balanced relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Now, there are some important concepts in analytical psychology, which we might call some archetypes. And so I was saying there are many archetypes, but today I would like to talk about the persona, which is intimately related to our identity, the Animus and Anima, which are very famous archetype, but nowadays are very controversial, and the shadow. So in Jung's model of the psyche, there are various personified structures that interact with one another in our inner world. This means that all these archetypes interact with one another. And actually, the unconscious is not like divided into sectors. It's, as I was saying before, all these elements are juxtaposed, and it's more like a kind of heterogeneous substance, not an homogeneous one. Two of these archetypes or personified structures, the persona and the anima animus, are relational. And for example, the persona, what oneself as well as others thinks what is not actually what one really is. So it's related to the perception other has and one has of who we are. Also, the persona is an element of the personality that arises for reasons of adaptation or personal convenience. So it is very close to the ego complex. While the persona relates to the external world, the anima animus relates to the internal world and is akin to the soul, although not the same. Now, the ego, which is primarily body-based and may be understood as the executive part of the personality, stands alongside the shadow. And these two have to do with our identity. I'll talk about the shadow in a while. Regarding the anima animus, these are the archetypal symbols for the masculine and feminine unconscious, respectively. They are the natural archetypes that sums up all the statements of the unconscious, of the primitive mind, of the history of language, culture, and religion. The anima is usually related to the emotional, empathetic, and sensitive aspects of the unconscious, and it is not to be understood as the soul in the dogmatic sense, but in a symbolic or metaphorical one. As an inner personality, the anima or anima is complementary to the persona and stands in a compensatory relationship to it. Now, the inner masculine, the animus, the anima is the feminine aspect of man. according to Jung, which he wrote this in the 1920s and 1930s. So nowadays, this because of our cultural, the shifts in our cultural experience, this might have changed a bit. So we're talking more about not men or women, but the identity one has as men or women, because I might be a man, uh, someone that was assigned at birth a sex as a male, but if I feel as a female, it is probable that my unconscious might have the counterpart archetype. So um, since we're talking about the Jung's model, I'm gonna keep talking about what the way he expressed anima and animus. So for him, the animus was the inner masculine side of women. Like the anima in a man, the animus is both a personal complex and an archetypal image. The animus corresponds to Jung to the paternal logos, just as the anima corresponds to the maternal eros. Okay? Animus is related to the active, intellectual, exploring side of personality. Although the anima and animus are generally associated with men and women, respectively, both sexes possess aspects of both archetypes. And as I was saying, these are among the most challenged Jungian concepts because of their apparent sexist implications. But also, as I was talking about, we can adjust this concept to our more recent understanding about sex identity and gender identity. Now, the shadow. The shadow is the hidden, repressed, sometimes called inferior and guilt-laden personality complex, whose ultimate ramification reached back into the realm of our ancestor. In the same manner that the ego is more proximal or closer to the external world, to the society, the shadow is closer to the unconscious, to our inner world, and to the personal and collective unconscious. It has been believed, and in some places it is still believed, that the shadow was the source of evil. When talking about myths and some religious motives, the shadow is represented by the evil. It can also be ascertained that the shadow does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also of several good qualities, as normal instincts, appropriate reactions to some exigencies that we have to confront in our daily lives, some realistic insights, and creative impulses. Archetypes. This is a very important concept in Jungian or analytical psychology. And the collective unconscious contains the psychological content that each of us has inherited from our evolutionary past and therefore shares with all other human beings, as I was saying before. And Jung discusses this concept and its effect on the conscious mind in terms of archetypes. Archetypes do not really exist. It's just an heuristic way for Jung to talk about what's going on the unconscious, which is not directly accessible. They manifest as especially potent images that have been expressed through the ages in such mythological and religious motives as birth, death, evil, transcendence, and many others. They also imply the inherited psychological patterns linked to the instincts. They are also the deposits of the constantly repeated experiences of humanity, which implies that they are universal elements of human experience, sources of psychic energy, and vital components of psychological health, which is important. They are powerful instinctive forces that consciousness experiences indirectly as wholly unexpected, new, and even strange. Although the archetypes can only become conscious in individual experience, Jung understands them to be universal pre-existent pathways which are merely filled out by individual experiences. So the individual experience gives content to these formal elements that we have inherited to our human evolution, and Jung in some instances says to our animal evolution, or even going further, these formal elements might be part of a psychic reality which permeates the whole of existence, not just animal existence. Archetypes might surface in dreams, projections, hallucinations, and visions, and they might express themselves with a numinous effect. They behave like highly charged autonomous centers of power, and they exert a fascinating and possessive influence upon the conscious mind, and thus can produce extensive alterations in the subject. The archetype as an image of instinct is a spiritual goal towards which the whole nature of mind strives. All of us strive towards this spiritual goal, even though we might not know it. And important for psychopathology, archetypes might become problematic when consciousness becomes too much one-sided, that it represses their manifestation, or when the ego is so overwhelmed by their sudden and unexpected emergence. Now, probably the most important archetype is the self. And through history and religious experiences and mythological tales, the self has probably is related to the God image. So that's why Jung called the self the central archetype. And he says that many people experience this self archetype as God. Now, the self as a psychological totality is for Jung indistinguishable, as I was saying, from this archetypal God image. And when they talk about the self archetype, they are referring to motives of spiritual transformation and images of wholeness. And they might be represented in images such as mandala, bridges, the sun, or again, God. The ego's relationship to the self is often also represented as this relationship to God, to the creator in religious myths. Now, I wanted to talk about each one of these products of the unconscious, but for the sake of time, I couldn't, so I have to hide these slides. But among other, Jung talks about the following contents or products of the unconscious, like dreams, fantasies, visions, delusions, images, memories, emotions, hallucinations, daydreaming, etc. And we can understand all these phenomena as material or content arising from the unconscious and manifesting in one form or another. They consist of unconscious processes obtruding on consciousness, but they are not directly what's going on in the unconscious. It's just the way that the ego, with its executive powers, organizes these unconscious processes, which are never directly accessible. Okay, so now, in relation to the topic that brings us here today, we can also say that psychedelic-induced images, visions, hallucinations, and delusions can also be seen as products of the unconscious. Well, now, let's talk about psychedelics, its relation to neuroscience. So we can come afterwards to the relation between psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy as understood by analytical psychology. The term psychedelic derived from the Greek roots psyche, which means soul or mind, or the Greek soul was actually the meaning they gave to psyche, but well, since the Enlightenment, we have been talking about psyche as well, actually after Descartes, we've been talking about psyche as our mind. And the law or the lone means to reveal or to manifest. And for 200 years, or well, around 200 years, The ethnographic research evidences that the almost universal use of psychedelic in medicinal and sacred rituals contexts across time and cultures. In the same manner, archaeological records suggest that may have been part of human culture for centuries, if not millennia, across almost all the continents. In traditional societies, the ritualized use of psychedelics produces profound psychological and somatic healing changes. So, psychedelic-assisted rituals represent a very ancient tradition in treating ailments of the soul and the psyche that predates protein analysis by centuries. Modern research, which combines therapeutic applications with the most advanced technologies in brain imaging could be conceptualized as a synthesis of the profoundly archaic with the hypermodern known as white coat shamanism. One of the reasons why psychedelic neuroscience, as it is called today, would help advance the understanding of human psychology is the ability of these substances to make the unconscious accessible to research and experimental verification, but not just to research and experimental verification, but also to some therapeutic context. So if we can access the unconscious, and since Jung was talking about the individuation process, which means bringing the unconscious to meet consciousness, we're also talking about that psychedelic substances might facilitate this individuation process. So psychedelics, to the extent that they decrease the entropic rigidity of some mental conditions, and I can talk about brain entropy in a moment, increase plasticity and favor change. They favor the access also to the deepest sectors of the psyche, which are contained in the unconscious, and psychedelics have been described in this manner as non-specific amplifiers of the unconscious that facilitate deep exploration of the psyche. These are one of the reasons why psychedelics could contribute from the neurosciences to the understanding of some of the Freudian and Jungian principles. So psychedelics might help us gain access to the unconscious for research and experimental verification, for therapeutic purposes, and for and to gain more a deeper understanding of Freudian, Jungian, and psychodynamic principles. Also, for Jung, a psychedelic substance causes a condition that he described as lowering the threshold of consciousness, which means making the our consciousness or the ego more permeable to the contents of the unconscious. It is important to remind that Jung didn't favor the use of psychedelics. He had many conversations with Aldous Huxley, and he said that there wasn't a need to use psychedelics to access the unconscious, and that they might even be dangerous. But let's take into account that there wasn't a set or setting, like a protocol-like set or setting, which might reduce this risk when Jung was alive. So maybe today, with an appropriate setting, the use of psychedelic might be safer in this context when compared to Jung's time. So, but it's important for me to remind that Jung didn't favor the use of psychedelics while he was alive. So, what Jung meant by the lowering of the threshold of consciousness is that this could breach the barrier between the conscious and the unconscious minds. We're not talking about minds, but mental processes. Now, allowing unconscious images and emotions to enter and potentially overwhelm consciousness is an important, I would say, tool for therapists to bring the transformation that Jung called the individuation process, and that gets us closer to that holistic experience or wholeness of the self that Jung talked about. Two important concepts for neuroscience of psychedelics and for the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy are the primary process thinking and the secondary process thinking. This is more, it's not, they are not Jungian concepts, but probably more Freudian concepts. And I do not remember where did Freud got these concepts from, but in he got them from I don't know if Pierre Janet or I'm missing the author, but you're not Freudian concept, but he used them a lot. When we talk about primary process of thinking, we're talking about processes that are inductive, synthetic, non-semantic, parallel, predominantly affective, and where temporal and spatial dimensions are not well defined. And when we are talking about secondary process thinking, we're talking about processes that tend to be deductive, syllogistic, logical, analytical, semantic, sequential, and that organizes information within a well-defined spatial and temporal dimensionality. We can see that since the times of probably Plato or even more Aristotle, the history of the Western culture have been getting stronger and stronger in secondary process thinking. So that's why it is so important for us today. This renaissance of the psychedelics and this looking back to the Eastern tradition and to our ancient inheritance, where the primary process thinking was more prevalent. Now, in relation to this, from the philogenetic and ontogenetic points of view, the processes that assist primary thinking appears first in the first years of life or in the dawn of humanity, and later there appears the processes that assist secondary thinking. The cognitive, cognitive, which is just a manner of saying the cognitive functions of the unconscious are attributed to primary process. So the unconscious functions have a type of primary process thinking, while consciousness has a type of secondary process thinking. Now, at the neurobiological level, the structures that are supposed to support primary thinking are located. When they are located in the subcortical level, we're talking about the limbic system, and cortically in the right hemisphere. And the secondary processes are thought to derive from the activity in the left hemisphere and the regions that constitute the default mode network. I was mentioning before the importance of the setting, and the opening of the unconscious, or accessing the unconscious, or facilitating the unconscious to access consciousness. And because of Jung's, how would I say it? Jung's reticence to use the psychedelics to access for therapy. People like Stanislav Grof, they try to standardize how to do psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So many contemporary researchers are sensitive to these issues that you raised about the indiscriminate opening of the unconscious. And two of the concepts used in contemporary psychedelic-assisted therapies to address these issues are the set and setting. Set refers to the mindset and background that the participant brings to the session, and the setting refers to the therapeutic context in which the therapy is administered. It is important also to reduce this risk, to explore risk factors, for example, organic diseases, also, I don't like to say mental health disorders, but if people are more susceptible to have a psychotic breakdown under psychedelics, it is important to take this into consideration. Also, it is very important to conduct a pre-session counseling to ensure adequate readiness and preparation prior to the session, because the symbolic effectiveness of the intervention depends a lot on how often the participant is how open this participant is to the experiences, to the symbolic experience. And in the same line of thought, post session, it is important that there be a symbolic re-elaboration of the experience. It's not just the psychedelic experience during the 4 or 6 hours with the psychedelic, the music, and the therapies that is important. It's the pre-counseling, the preparation, and then the re-elaboration of this experience that are important, probably even more. Now, the administration of psychedelics should take place in a favorable environment that seeks to guarantee a positive and risk-free, or almost risk-free, access to the unconscious. And Eisner, which she in the 60s and 70s worked with psychedelics in the University of California, if I can remember, she said that music was an essential aspect in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I had also some slides about Eisner's work, but it would take too long to get into them. Now, also talking about session setting, um, they they do not have to be rigidly protocolized, but it is important to have some protocols. Um, Not only to seek to ensure adequate preparation, but also a positive integration of the unconscious materials that comes forward in the weeks following the session. So this might need many psychotherapeutic sessions after the experience with the psychedelic. It is also very important the therapeutic relationship between the therapist and the participant, because this facilitates the healing experiences and the positive outcomes in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Now, as I was saying before, that Jung's concept of individuation through conscious integration of unconscious material offers an interesting framework for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Now, we could talk of psychedelics as psychointegrators. This means that psychotherapy, guided by analytical psychology and assisted with psychedelics, should place a strong emphasis on the importance of self-integration, the wholeness I was talking about when mentioning how the compensatory interaction between consciousness and unconscious is part of a self-regulatory system with purpose and intelligence. And this should be a long-term therapeutic goal. Again, individuation process. So, since psychedelics facilitate access to the unconscious and the psychotherapy facilitate the integration of conscious and unconscious material, we could talk about psychedelics and the psychotherapy as psychointegrators. They facilitate integration between now neurologically or neurobiologically speaking, the integration between subcortical systems, philogenetically older, which relates to unconscious activity with cortical systems of more recent phylogenetic appearance, and which are associated with consciousness and the ego complex. So this implies an increased connectivity between the primary process brain systems and the secondary process system, which are associated with the default mode network and the ego complex. Keeping in line with these hypotheses of the relation between the neurobiology and analytical psychology, we could say that different, and this is a theory advanced by Carl Jung, we could say that different brain subsystems are integrated through modulation of the serotonin nervous system. The serotonin 2A receptor increases entropy, which means that makes more plastic or increases plasticity, facilitates change in the brain, and serotonin 1A receptors decreases entropy because it fixes in habits or some behaviors some experiences. It is important when things are working well, we need 1A receptors because we want to consolidate these behaviors. But when things are not going well, to be excessively rigid will perpetuate these things we are wrongly doing. So there are many instances, especially in psychopathology, in which increased entropy is important, and psychedelics, most of them which act through serotonin 2A receptors, will facilitate this increased entropy. So I was saying this increase in entropy is an important feature of non-ordinary states of consciousness in general, but they are greatly increased by the use of psychedelics. We can have no ordinary states of consciousness when meditating or in some trance states that religious in some religious contexts. But the psychedelics facilitates them like through a shortcut. The concept of individuation implies actually the integration of consciousness and the unconscious, resulting in a state of wholeness or holistic self, as I was saying before. And psychedelics are believed to promote this process. Now, from an evolutionary or philogenetic perspective, the default mode network involves the structures of the human neural architecture that are not even observed in primates or just barely observed, and includes the theory of mind, mental time travel, which is important for the continuity of the ego and or self through time. I mean, like going back in my memories or projecting myself in the future, and metacognition, which is, you might know better than me, the ability not only to have thoughts, but also to have thoughts about thoughts. Also, the default mode network is believed to be the basis of the secondary process thinking and the self-reflexive capacity. And this makes reference to the ego complex studied by Freud and Jung. It has also been implicated, I mean, the default mode network, in the vulnerability, the special vulnerability of our species to develop some specific forms of psychopathology. And this vulnerability is believed to be the result of the evolution of the default mode network and secondary process thinking from a more archaic primary process system of socio-affective awareness. Now, we talked about a phylogenetic perspective, which is the evolutionary perspective. Now, from an ontogenetic perspective, from the development of the individual, not of the species. The default mode network is not yet fully developed in children, and the adult form is not fully consolidated until very advanced, the adolescence or young adulthood. In early infancy and young children, like other animals, there predominates the primary process thinking. And children and early infants lack the secondary process thinking cognitive abilities that are more typical of adolescents and adults. We could go back to Erickson's developmental model, and we could see how this is related. Many forms of mental illnesses begin during this critical period of adolescence, which is related to the emergence of more consolidated default mode network. And it is also associated to a social and neural maturation that begins or accentuates during the pubertal and post-pubertal period. This suggests that our unique form of cognitive and social development may explain, at least partially, the vulnerability of our species to the development of some psychopathological disorders. Now, how could psychedelic help us transit from secondary process to primary process? Because as I was saying before, Westerners are, not all of them, but generally very one-sided in the secondary process thinking, logical thinking, deductive thinking, sequential thinking, and we are missing this primary process thinking, which when integrated to this secondary process thinking, we could achieve a wholeness, and we could um, how would you say, I'm sorry, take what the unconscious could offer us for healing, and not just for healing, but for expanding our life, our conscious life. So psychedelics are believed to facilitate that regression from adult forms of secondary process thinking to the primary process thinking typical of childhood, potentially also to the primary process cognitive styles of hominids evolutionary older than the Homo sapiens. It is likely that such a transition partially explains its spatial therapeutic potential. I was talking about how the default mode network, secondary process thinking, is related to some form of psychopathology. Also, one of the findings of the psychedelic neuroscience is the ability of such compounds to collapse the neural hierarchies associated with the default mode network configurations. So, psychedelics are thought to reduce activity in the default mode networks by first, increasing connectivity between primary and secondary cognitive systems, and two, by improving the intermodular connectivity among different brain regions. Also, they increase the sensitivity to visual and auditory phenomena typical of some non-ordinary states of consciousness. By decreasing the activity of the default mode network and the subsequent transition from secondary process to primary process, we could see a correlation of this with the experience of the dissolution of the ego, which, as I was saying before, it is more more like we make the ego more porous. It's not a total dissolution, but it lowers the threshold of consciousness. Okay, so the transition from secondary process to primary process evident in the non-ordinary state of consciousness is associated with the dissolution or the with breaking the limits of the ego and the experience of holistic consciousness because of this integration with unconscious elements. It triggers an alteration in the self-other differentiation, leading to a reduction of the egocentric or ego-centered social cognitive bias in which Western societies live today. It also allows the brain to be rewired. And now we're talking again about this increased brain entropy that are facilitated by the psychedelics. But this is true if the patient receives an appropriate intervention or counseling. The integration between primary process thinking and the more recently evolved brain systems that psychedelics seem to facilitate parallels the integration of consciousness and unconscious content described by psychoanalysis, and analytical psychology. So Jung, psychedelic neuroscience and the psychedelic-assisted therapy. I think I might be close to the end of the presentation. Jung suggested that the archetype of the self was physiologically located in the subcortical affective brain systems associated with the primary processes. The collective unconscious manifests itself more frequently in the dreams of children who possess at their age a relatively weak form of consciousness. This implies a form of primary process that lacks a fully consolidated form of default mode network, and psychosis, non-ordinary states of consciousness, phenomenology, trance states, mystical or spiritual experiences, and dreams, among others, all involve reversions or regressions to primary process thinking styles. Jung believed that psychedelics expose a level of the unconscious that also manifests itself in mystical states or in the analysis of unconscious phenomena, though he wasn't very in favor of their use. Also, the subjectivity implied in Jung's concept of the self entails an expanded, diffuse primary process thinking type of thinking sensibility, devoid of any clear cognitive distinction between the external objective and the internal subjective worlds, meaning between the persona, and the personal and collective unconscious. Psychedelics facilitate the collapse of the fundamental duality of consciousness, such as self and other, subject and object, internal and external. This alteration of the neuronal architecture implies a transition, again, from secondary process to primary process thinking, with the subsequent dissolution of the limits of the ego. Now we're talking about the limits of the ego, not a dissolution of the ego. This gives rise to the archetypal, holistic experience found in various religious traditions, and which Freud called, in some instances, the oceanic experience of some trance states. Psychedelics reduce top-down neuronal processing and increase bottom-up information flows. This means that it reduces the more cortical-oriented cognitive processes related to secondary processes, thinking, and facilitates a bottom-up information flow, which are philogenetically speaking, older structures. They decrease the inhibitory influence of the frontal region on the central, parietal, and occipital, especially right regions, resulting in the experience of a rich variety of visual images. Also, psychedelics, when ingested in, this is very important, when ingested in ritual or ritually oriented clinical settings involving music, produce a unity religious experience, meaning the oceanic experience, implying a loss of ego boundaries and an enhancement of visual and auditory modalities. Now, as way of conclusions or take-home messages, we could say that the study of psychedelic neuroscience and therapies associated with analytical psychology could broaden the impact of psychedelic-assisted therapies in the treatment of psychopathological conditions, but not only psychopathological conditions, but in the personal growth, because many people do not seek these experiences or rituals just because they are sick, which I don't know what sick means, but just because they're looking for to reconnect with that spiritual core that makes us human, or just for personal growth. Also, Jung's concept of individuation, I mean, the integration of the archaic unconscious with consciousness, seems extremely pertinent to modern psychedelic research. Also, it is possible to integrate the concepts of psychedelic neuroscience and the perspective derived from analytical psychology developed by Jung. Likewise, the integration of various disciplines like archaeology, anthropology, neurosciences, psychology, and evolutionary theory, and non-ordinary states of consciousness represents a significant enrichment of the Jungian models of the psyche. It is also important, and we are talking in a university scenario, further research in this area is warranted. So it is what uniMIND is doing, and many other societies, is really, really, really important for the future of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and for, well, our 21st century culture. Well, thank you everyone for your assistance, for your attention, and well, I'm open for questions or suggestions, doubts.
Well, Juan, thank you so much. I think before we go to the questions, I would like to express my deep gratitude for putting together such a elaborate and rich presentation. So also it connected, for me personally, a lot of dots. We had quite a few loose ends from our discussion from last week. So definitely a lot of very valuable input. I heard a lot of scribing and typing behind me, so I assume there are quite a few questions. So I would like to start here with maybe one or two questions, and then we can also ask our online audience if they want to know anything.
Great, thank you, Steven.
Yeah. I have two questions.
Yeah.
So the first question is, at one point in your presentation, you mentioned that there's sort of a collaboration between the consciousness and unconscious. So this is the part about the Jungian psychology. And I was wondering how that collaboration between the conscious and unconscious, it's deemed as intelligent and purposeful. Could you explain that a bit more? Because that's not immediately obvious to me.
Yeah, sure. It's not immediate. Thank you for the question, first of all. Yeah, it's not obvious because when we talk about purposeful and intelligent, actually we're talking about secondary process thinking or conscious type of thinking processes. When talking about the unconscious, Jung really very hard time because it is not possible to talk about the non-cognizable aspects of the self. But when interacting in clinical settings with his clients, he realized, especially when analyzing dreams, that dreams were trying to kind of guide the conscious mind to some equilibrium. As I was saying in the presentation, there is a compensating relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And when the conscious mind goes too much one-sided, the unconscious tries to bring it back. For example, when fever might be an example, when talking about the physical organism. Fever is a symptom which is trying to bring an equilibrium back by trying to eradicate an organism, a microorganism that is putting in danger the organism, the individual organism. So as the fever is trying to bring this homeostasis back by a kind of symptom, the unconscious symptoms like some hysterical symptoms, for example, or some dream images, or sleep of the tongue, or some unconscious attitudes one is not aware of. He says that there is a purpose behind this because it's trying to regulate something that has gone astray. A manner of saying intelligent. Again, the unconscious is not intelligent, but it's not only chaos. I think that that's what he meant. It's not just chaotic. It's got some it's looking forward to something. And again, he saw this in the dreams of many people because the dreams, I would like to have an example of a dream, but because the dreams were trying to, through images and symbols, to tell the dreamer something that was wrong with their life in that moment, and which was producing some symptoms or was making the dreamer to commit the same mistakes again and again and again. So when analyzing these dreams, he saw that it looks like the unconscious had some purpose to bring the self back to the equilibrium, and there is a kind of intelligence behind this purposefulness of the unconscious. But I'm with you. It would be great if we had different words to describe the unconscious processes and distinctively from the conscious processes, because there are two different types of minds, to say in a way. I don't know if I answered your question or make it even more.
Yeah, I think that answered my question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that answered my question. It was more like, so it's more like the information that comes from the unconsciousness. It's more like, I interpret it kind of as sequential, so there's a certain logic to it. And then I would say Jung referred to it as sort of intelligent because it would make sense to us if we would think about it in hindsight. But the function is sort of purposeful. I sort of caught on the meaning to what you're trying to say, but it's yeah, it's a bit hard to grasp, of course, but it's kind of abstract. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question.
Maybe before you take the next question, could you stop sharing your screen so we can make it full screen, our videos? That would be great.
I'll give you a second. Okay.
Yes, perfect. All right, we have quite a few people online. Does any one of them have a question? Otherwise, I think we have also quite a few questions in this room.
Someone is talking about a dream example. Do you have the questions? It's just that...
I think David was just adding a point to what you said.
Yeah, I was just adding to as an example for a dream that is not completely random and without purpose. It was in the PDF shared. So there's a dream by a morphine addict who is dreaming about being in a boat on the sea, and he was dipping his hand in the water and then his arm disappeared. That was just as an example, yeah.
Okay, thank you, David. There's another example that just came to my mind, and which Jung referred in one of his papers, and it's a dream about Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylon king, and actually it's in the Bible. And Daniel, the prophet, was in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar, the second, had a dream in which he was laying down on the ground, and there was a tree growing from his navel, and the tree had like a kind of lizard, a huge lizard surrounding it, and there were no fruits in the tree, and actually there were many crowds standing in the branches. And what Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar was that he was aspiring to things too great, and that he should lower his expectancies. Like kind of, you should not aspire to that great deeds that you're thinking to go forward. So he didn't listen to Daniel, and he went into war, and he lost the war, and many people died. So in this case, the dream was saying that, kind of like Icarus and Daedalus, that he was flying too high, and the dream was telling him that you should lower your flight if you want to keep forward with your kingdom. So there was purpose and a kind of intelligence behind this dream image. I don't know if it helps.
Yeah, I also, when you said purposive, I also understood it in relation to the self or the individuation process, so that there might be this purpose of becoming the self that is in the end, and that the unconscious works in a way that it tries to manifest itself, so we come closer towards this balanced or wholeness state. Do you agree with this, or?
No, I totally agree, because this push toward equilibrium, homeostasis, is actually the individuation process. The self refers to the totality of the psychic experience, conscious and unconscious. And since we, and when I say we, I'm talking about the 21st century culture, have gone to one-sided. We are missing lots of this information, lots of this, and regulating forces from the unconscious. So the individuation process, seeking wholeness, coming back to equilibrium. Some people from Eastern society might say the way of the Tao, the connecting with the yin and yang. We're talking about saying about integrating opposites, and I think we're talking about the same when you're talking about the individuation process, and when I'm talking about the coming back into equilibrium, and that's the purpose. Is as I was saying, one compensates the other, because I don't like to talk about primitive societies because it's kind of pejorative, but Jung referred to them as primitive societies because from the time he was writing his books, and they went to one-sided on the unconscious type of thinking, and they had to confront or to address many circumstances that Westerners, with their logical thinking, have addressed in better ways than these other societies. But it's the same the other way around. So I'm not just saying that the primary type of thinking or secondary type of thinking is one better than the other. What is really important is the integration of both. And the individuation process is actually looking forward or seeking this integration. I have, for example, superstitious people that experience reality or symbols or spirits or that have some non-objective experiences and experience them as totally real without their symbolic meaning. They are totally overwhelmed by primary process thinking. We can see this, for example, in schizophrenia, where there is no distinction between the objective and the subjective. So in this example, we are totally dominated by the unconscious. And well, we can crash ourselves with reality if we do not gain some contact with the objective world too. But it's the same way around, as for example, in the obsessive, which goes to work every day, doesn't believe in the spirituality of human beings, and everything has to be rational. What's happening today that many people have lost the meaning of life, because rationally speaking, logically speaking, life doesn't have any meaning. We're just carbon-made beings in a universe of elements of the periodic table. So what is important is to integrate this perspective, the subjective one with the objective one. In the end, we live in an environment, but we are subjects living in this environment. So it's this intersection between the two which is important to address.
Thank you very much. Sabi wrote a question in the chat, and I think you addressed it in the beginning briefly, but because it's such a relevant topic, maybe you can go into it again. So the apparent contradiction between quote unquote experiencing and ego death. So if the ego truly dies, what is there to experience its quote unquote dissolution?
Well, I think that when the ego, as I was saying at the beginning, is that part or structure, is that structure of the psyche which is related to awareness. Okay, so this is according to Jung. We can have a debate around this. It's not like a truth, universal truth. This is according to Jung. Awareness and ego are intimately related. So if there is no ego, there is no awareness. So we can speak about there can be for example, in the schizophrenic, I can feel that my movement do not belong to me. Someone else is moving me. Okay, so I have lost my agentic capacity, but I still feel it is happening to me. So there is still a me there. So when we're talking about the dissolution of the ego, this agentic capacity might dissolve, but there is someone who is experiencing this dissolution of the ego. So we gotta be careful when we say dissolution of the ego, because we might be thinking I disappear, but there is an I disappearing, but not a me disappearing. I don't know if I'm expressing it well. There's always a me who's got the ego. There's always a me with a collective unconscious. The subject is always there. So when we are talking about the dissolution of the ego, we're talking about this lowering the threshold of consciousness. We're talking about facilitating the flooding of the unconscious material onto the totality of the self, and we can experience it with awareness, for example, when we remember a dream, or we can not be aware of it, as for example, when an artist paints and he doesn't know the meaning of the painting, but there's a product over there. The unconscious processes were active while the artist was painting. So, but there was always a me behind it. So, yeah, we can say that the ego dissolves or the ego dies, but it depends how we speak about the ego, because the ego, because if there is no awareness without ego, we could never talk about what's going on in the unconscious. So yeah, I think it's a figure of speech, but we should not take it literally, because the ego, when the ego dies, that's a coma, I think, where you lose your I-ness and me-ness. But this is an open debate. It's just my opinion, because actually I think it's a very interesting question. That people, when they talk about their experience of their nirvana, or when people talk about some mystical experience where they lose the boundaries between self and other, they might be talking about this experience of ego death. But as I was saying, it's a figure of speech, and it depends what it means to you.
I had another question that I've been pondering for a long time, so maybe you can help me with it. Thinking about the Anima and Animus, I also found this dichotomy to be present in the plant medicines used in South America, especially if you look at ayahuasca versus San Pedro. There's also a clear association with a feminine spirit, the grandmother spirit, Mother Ayahuasca, to ayahuasca, and the grandfather spirit, the masculine, to San Pedro. So what is your perception of where this comes from? Is it something innate to the medicine, to the substance, that makes us give these associations, or is it priming, or what do you think?
Jung, well, not only Jung, and many traditions, when they talk about the genesis of the universe, they always say everything came from chaos, like, which would be represented by the number 0. And there came the one, and the one was divided into 2, and the 2 they then came together, and were free. one, two, and the couple. I'm saying this because the structure of the universe is this. It's polar, the whole universe, according not only to Jung, but to the Gnostics and to many other traditions. So we could be talking about celestial bodies. We could talking about the sexes of the animals. We could be talking about the spirits of the places. I guess there are places with more masculine spirits, and there are other places with more feminine spirits. So I don't have a personal experience with San Pedro, but with the ayahuasca, and I don't know from your experience which one would be the masculine or feminine. For me, the ayahuasca, probably because my unconscious anima, I had a really kind of connection with the female qualities of the psyche. But I think that the whole of existence, that everything that does exist in the world, because the world exists because of dualities, and has one of the other. I think that there are not pure animals or pure anima in the things that exist, but probably is more like there are proportions, more animals or more anima in some substances, places, beings. So as I was saying, I think it's part of the structure of the universe, duality. So yeah, and the two poles, you can call it feminine, masculine, eros, logos, animus, yin, yang. We're talking about the same.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We had some questions in the chat. Have they been resolved or not?
I think so.
Yeah, I think yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
As you go through the process of individuation, so let's say that you reach, like you expand your sphere of consciousness, does the unconscious get a better way of linking itself into consciousness? So instead of through dreams, you're more able to understand your unconscious in less, like, can you talk to your unconscious on a daily basis rather than the unconscious having to find a way to get to your conscious state? Like, can you actually develop a relationship with your unconscious that is more conscious in a way?
Well, that's a great question, actually, and that's the whole purpose and meaning of the analytical psychology, psychotherapy, because it's to train you to have a conversation with your unconscious, because when the unconscious appears like spontaneously, overwhelmingly, and without your awareness,
So,
it is mostly through symptoms. So the idea is to kind of talk to the unconscious. You cannot directly talk to the unconscious, but relating to the symbolic significance of your dreams, for example, is a way to talk to your unconscious, to learn to analyze your dream. To another way is to, for example, through the religious experiences that might bring you a relationship to God, to an aspect of humanity like love, for example, and feeling this viscerally, feeling this like embodied, not just logically. This is a way to be in contact with the unconscious. When we say conversation with the unconscious, probably we're talking about translating the primary process thinking to secondary process thinking, but that's not always necessary. We can experience it without putting it into words.
Yeah, I was more thinking about not actually talking with it, but listening to it, so that it doesn't have to shout, basically. No?
Exactly. It's in actually the process would be more listening to it.
Okay.
But it's a conversation, because if there is listening, there's a conversation that, yeah, probably not talking. For example, taking a trip to a very spiritually charged place, like through a ritual, this might be a way to get to come into contact with the unconscious. Most of the rituals are ways to are conversations with the unconscious.
Yeah.
Actually, in some cases, when in a sexual relationship, you can conversate with the unconscious experientially. That's the tantric tradition, for example. So yeah, I think it is better if we do, it's not going back, but if we recover some of previous traditions from societies that still persist today, because we have lost most of the rituals on our life. Okay, and we need rituals to get into contact with the unconscious, with God, with the spirits. It doesn't matter how you call it, but rituals are really important. Connecting with humanity as a whole, for example, with your couple, with your children, with your parents, with a place, and that's just sometimes looking into the dawn on a nice landscape. This might be a conversation with the unconscious, or looking at a starry night and letting yourself go, and letting yourself get this oceanic feeling. This is a conversation with the unconscious without any symptom mediating between the two, because a paralysis, a hysterical paralysis, is also a conversation with the unconscious. The paralysis, actually the interpretation of the symptom, helps the symptom disappear, because you are listening to your unconscious, and it doesn't need to keep talking to you with symptoms. So yeah, I think your question is really, really important, because that's the purpose of all this.
Thank you.
Yes, one last question, because we also have to move the tables later, but yes, go ahead, Robert.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. First of all, it was really interesting. You said that psychedelic effects, or also like the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, is likely due to them facilitating like a shift from adult forms of secondary processing to primary processing, which is typically more of a child. So would you say that means that psychedelics experiences are somewhat comparable to childhood experiences? And if so, like in your view, what does that mean for us as humans and the whole process of like growing up?
Great, thank you for the question. Well, I would say that, yeah, it facilitates action, the type of thinking that children use, but it's not childish thinking. For example, if you see on when a client in your clinic, and a children draws a picture, a painting, and he's talking a lot about what's going on his inside, without almost any reflection. Okay, so lots of information is coming forward, again, without any rational or logical thinking. So it's their type of thinking is closer to what's going on in unconscious. Another example, the dreams of children tend to be more vivid. Most of us remember one or two dreams from our childhood. Many of us don't remember any of the dreams, but they tend to be more graphic, more vivid. So again, it's closer to the processes of the unconscious. Now, why would this be important for the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? Because what we're looking forward is to integrate the conscious processes with unconscious processes. And since this type of thinking, the primary process thinking, which is more active in children, is closer to the unconscious processes, gaining access to them, doing a regression to this childhood type of thinking from the perspective of the adult is actually a type of integration of the conscious and the unconscious, not a total integration, but that's why it would facilitate the objectives of the therapy. Also, children, their innocence, their lack in many instances of all these edifice of prejudices, opinions, and facilitates also to gain access to the collective unconscious. There's not that much personal layers of personal consciousness that might cloud all that information that, as I was saying, we have inherited from years and years of humanity, or mammals, or interacting with an environment that has always seen the sun coming up and then setting every night, with the moon changing every month, and this gotta be ingrained in us, other experiences. So going to a type of primary process thinking or childhood type of thinking is even a better way to get access to all that information that is in the collective unconscious, because the layers of personal unconscious are thinner, as a way of saying it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Juan, for joining us again for the presentation, also now for the really nice discussion. Unfortunately, we have to get going now because we're going to be kicked out soon. So yes, thank you so much. And yeah, have a nice evening.
You do. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
For coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.